On the surface, Tony Van Straubenzee has had a charmed life. Ran his own successful executive search firm, married very well, had some nice kids too, memorably hung out with Audrey Hepburn and Ronald Reagan through his volunteer work. But he also admits, quote, "I didn't like my father, and I'm sure he didn't like me." He lost a brother to war and recently had to battle prostate cancer. It's been a very full life, chronicled in his memoir, which is called Rind in the Marmalade, a headhunter's tale. And Tony Van Straubenzee joins us now. It's great to have you here in our studio.
I'm very flattered to be here.
Well, the thing that surprised me so much about reading your book is that you know, for a guy who gets around town quite a bit, you don't pull any punches here. You are blunt about your relationship with your dad, as I suggest,
right,
about some of the big business titans in this city as well, about your friends. Why do that?
Well, I was encouraged by a lot of people to write down my stories. And it took me a long time to get down to it. And I finally did. And then I thought, well, I've got to make it interesting. And I've met all these people. I've, interviewed for them or with them. I know them. And I think they should be written about. I don't think I said anything terrible.
Not terrible,
yeah.
But you,
I was blunt.
You were blunt, yeah. You may have trouble having lunch in this town again.
I don't think so.
Okay, especially if you're paying, right?
You know, the funny thing is, I haven't heard any criticism yet. The only criticism I've heard are from people who said, I wasn't in your book. So there you go.
That's good criticism.
Yeah.
Let's talk about your dad. He comes home after World War II. In what kind of condition?
Well, I think he had post-traumatic stress disorder, probably. But we didn't talk about it in those days. Nobody sort of used that term. But he had been wounded. He wasn't the same man at all that he was before the war. I really didn't know him. I was only 2 when he went overseas. And when he came back, of course, it was a shock to me to have a father around. And I don't think his health was up to really looking after kids.
How much of a factor was alcohol in his bad moods?
It became a factor a little after he got back. I didn't notice it as much when I was 9 as I did when I was sort of 15. But it grew and grew and grew. And of course, going back into the Army, that era of soldier, the peace group under General Vokes, I mean, they all drank like fish. I mean, it was terrible.
Your brother Charlie did go into the military service?
He did.
Did that make your dad happy?
Very happy. He was very proud of my brother, and so was I. What
happened to Charlie?
Charlie was killed in the 1957 war in Egypt, and it was an accident in a scout car. Scout car turned over. He was on the border. It was peacekeeping. He was one of the few lieutenants chosen to go from Canada. So it was considered a great honor. We were all proud as punch. But unfortunately, the accident happened, and that didn't contribute to my father's well-being. He went more downhill then than he ever did.
How old were you when Charlie died?
19.
How'd you get over something like that? You loved him. He was really close with you.
He was my surrogate father.
Yeah.
And, he's the kind of brother that taught me how to drive a car, how to skate, how to swim. We were very close. And he named his son after me. And I didn't get over it very easily. The problem was that I didn't get to mourn particularly because they had the regiment had a funeral in Calgary. But I was left at home looking after my younger brother, who was 10 years younger than I was, and I also had a brother who was mentally challenged. So I had to stay home and look after him. So I never really got to a memorial.
You didn't for many, many years. We'll talk about that a little bit later.
Yeah.
After your brother died, your dad basically said, okay, it's up to you now to continue the family military tradition.
He did.
And what was your response to that?
Well, I was in the throes of university, and I wanted to get my degree. And I had no interest in the peacetime military. I mean, had there been a war or something, of course I would have served. But what I had seen at the Griesbach barracks and in the mess and the life of the peacetime soldier, particularly the officers, was disgraceful. I mean, they couldn't leave the mess until the general left the mess. So they all got smashed. And I used to have to undress my father when he got home at 2 in the morning. I had to take his boots off and his uniform.
So this was no life for you?
Oh, no, absolutely
And
not.
what did he think when you rejected his advice?
Well, he didn't actually talk to me directly. He talked to the general, and the general came and visited me and said, "You're a disgrace to your family, and you've got to go in the military or your father's going to be terribly upset." Well, there wasn't much I could say to him except, "I'm sorry, sir, but I'm going to university and I'm going to continue going to university."
I think it's fair to say, Tony, that every son wants the love, respect, affirmation from his father.
Yes.
And you never had it.
I never had it. It was a rather strange relationship. They sent me off to a private school when I was 9, and I don't think my father ever came to see me at the school. Other parents came, but he didn't come. I don't think he liked me very much, and I didn't like him. But
well, how much did that scar you?
Well, I guess it scarred me. I resented it a bit. I think I had a reasonably successful business career, and becoming president of the Empire Club. He was alive at that time, and a lawyer from Brecon, where he had a cottage, told me that he wouldn't watch the TV programs of my introductions and so on. And I said, "Well, did he watch the Reagan interview?" And he said, "No, he wouldn't watch that." So
you and President Ronald Reagan did something together.
I don't know whether my father did or didn't watch it, but there was never any sort of phone call saying congratulations or whatever.
Let's talk a bit about that business career, and to do that, I want to read one excerpt from the book here.
Sure.
When I had graduated from the University of Alberta and was looking for a career, I went to an interview with Prentice Hall Publishing House, which was looking for a sales representative. When I entered the sales manager's office, it stank of cigars. He ushered me to take a seat. "Can you sell?" he asked. "Yes, I believe so," I replied. "Then take this waste paper basket out of the room and bring it back in and sell it to me." The waste paper basket was filthy and filled with cigar stubs and other equally disgusting items. I thought about this briefly and decided I could not possibly sell it to anyone. So I returned to his office, dumped the contents all over his desk, and said, "I wouldn't sell this disgusting piece of crap to anyone," and walked out. Now, I want to know where a young kid gets the moxie to do that on a job interview.
Well, I think I'd been kept waiting a long time, and I was sort of getting madder and madder. And then the introduction of, would you sell this, and so on. And it was really really filthy. And I just lost it, I guess, and did
Yes,
it.
you did.
Yeah, I did. And I went home and thought, "Oh my God, what have I done?" But that was it.
There's a punchline to the story.
There is.
Fast forward. Go ahead. Tell it.
Well, years later, when I was in the executive search business, I was handling a search for, I believe it was Xerox, for a sales manager, and this poor fellow applied. And he came into my office and sat down, and I looked at him and I said, "Can you sell?" And he put his hands up to his face. He said, "Oh my God, I guess I'm toast." And I said, "Yes, you are."
So you kind of had a little revenge there.
I did. That was a mean thing to do, but he wasn't the right guy anyway.
As your career moved along, you did from time to time find yourself in some pretty heady company, in board meetings with some of the real titans at King and Bay in this country and town.
I was very lucky.
I'd like to know what you sort of learned about how the titans of business do business in this city.
Oh boy. Well, there were so many of them that were totally responsible. I just think that many of them gave of themselves a lot.
Tell the story about how they tried to save the opera.
Well, the opera was an interesting situation. I was sort of a soldier more than anything else at the opera. I did some fundraising, but I wasn't in any major role. But my friend John Cook, who later became the chairman of the Canadian Opera Company, was sent off to New York by A.E. Ames, and I was asked to sort of fill in for him when he was away.
Which was the company you were with at the time?
That's right, I was. And John called me and said, the opera's in terrible shape, and there's going to be a meeting and try to rescue it. Bank of Nova Scotia was rumored to be willing to call a loan if we didn't raise some money. So A.E. Ames appointed me to go over to the meeting. So I go into the huge boardroom of the Bank of Nova Scotia, and there is the vice chairman running the meeting, and a man by the name of Eric Brown from Canada Permanent. Crockett was the name of the vice chairman. And around the table were all these luminaries. I mean, Alan Lambert from the TD Bank and somebody senior from the Royal and such. And there's me, right, representing A.E. Ames. So as they went around the room, they started with the banks, and the bankers, Lambert said, well, I'll give you $5 million. I think it was $5 million. If you give the same amount to the Sick Kids campaign, which I'm chairing. And this sort of went on around the table. It was the most amazing thing, right? Unfortunately, then they got to the investment firms, and A.E. Ames was the first one asked. Well, boy, I was in trouble. I thought, oh my God, what am I going to say? So I mentioned a figure, and immediately, thank God, Wood Gundy and DS said, we're in for the same amount. But then I had to go back to the office and justify it. That wasn't easy.
But it is, it does give some insight into how these, and they were all men at the time, I guess,
well,
right? How these men did their thing.
And it was the old boys network. There's no question about it. And I suspect, when you asked me the question about boards, there were a lot of, you rub my back, I'll rub yours. A lot of people on the same boards. And that was a mistake. And that began to change, thank goodness, for the better. But there were some very responsible board members. Tony Fell, for example, very responsible board member.
And yet you took a little shot at him.
I did.
You took a little shot at him in the book.
Yeah, I did, but I don't think it was that bad.
Not that bad, but, anyway, it's there.
He's a big man.
He's a big man. He can take it. You were a headhunter for a lot of years, and one of the things that I guess you learned being a headhunter is that it's a good way to lose some friends. And I want you to tell us a story about Mac Campbell.
Well, this was a real tragedy. Mac Campbell was my best friend at school. And after we both got into university and such, he remained a very good friend of mine. He had some trouble readjusting to life at university after being the head boy at Trinity College School. He was absolutely an outstanding head boy, just wonderful guy. And he was also a hell of a football player. And I think he missed the cut for the University of Toronto Varsity Blues. And his girlfriend left him, and he had a bit of a downfall. So he picked himself back up and got back together again, but ended up in education. And he came to me often because we were close friends and said, what should I be doing? How should I go about all this? Anyway, the story that was so tragic was that I was asked to do the search for the headmaster of Trinity College School. And I was told by the board and by the search committee that there were no internal candidates. And Mac was on the staff of TCS at the time.
So ineligible.
Ineligible. But I was the messenger. So I had to phone him and say, look, Mac, I can't accept your application. They're not going to look at anybody inside. He took that personally and blamed me for it. And so our relationship fell apart. And I was just shattered, really.
And then what happened to him?
Well, he ended up later having problems with alcohol. And I'm not quite sure exactly what caused his death. But
he died young.
He died young.
And you guys never really reconciled?
We never reconciled. I tried to get some help for him when he was having health problems. And, if I walk into a room and he was there, he'd walk out. It was really a nasty blow.
Let's go from a downer to an upper then.
Yeah.
You pointed out you were the president of the Empire Club for a time.
I was.
And there you are in the kitchen talking to Ronald Reagan. How did all that happen?
Well, it was a wonderful story, really. Maybe I should just mention that I was not meant to be the president of the Empire Club. Barney Danson was supposed to take the job.
Former defense minister.
That's right, and a great friend of mine. And Barney was asked by the government to look into the Opera House and that whole period. I think Bob Ray was the premier, I can't remember.
Yep.
And so he was ineligible to take on the job. So they were out of a president. And I wasn't even a vice president of the Empire Club. And Nona MacDonald Heaslip, who's a wonderful lady, kept after me, saying, you got to take this job. And I didn't want to take it because I had a small practice and I was busy. And she invited me to her Christmas party, and there was Nona and Major General Bruce Legg. I don't know if you ever met him, but he was a force. And a bunch of other fellows. And they sort of got me semi-smashed at the Christmas party. And as I was leaving, Nona said to me, are you sure you wouldn't consider being the president? And I said, oh, maybe. And the next morning, the files all arrived at my door. And,
That's all it takes. Just takes a maybe.
Yeah, maybe. So I panicked, and I called upon my friends, Peter Godsoe at the Bank of Nova Scotia and Robin Younger at Dominion Securities, who got me an intro to Michael Wilson, whom I knew.
Former finance minister.
Former finance minister, and I had done some work for his campaign. And I asked Michael, I said, can I, with the June summit coming, can you deliver me one of the top people for the Empire Club? And he kind of laughed, and we joked about it. I didn't have any particular hope, but unbeknownst to me, he went behind the scenes and arranged it. And he called me one day and he said, I want you to take a couple fellows to lunch or dinner. And I said, who? I thought, he'd have me with some flunkies because he was off rubbing shoulders with the high and mighty. And he said, Reagan and Mulrooney. Well, you can imagine my reaction. But what was wonderful was the trust he put in me to do that. And then, of course, the whole thing. I had to deal with the security and the White House and the RCMP and the CBC, and, it was huge.
So what did you say to Reagan when you saw him in the kitchen ready to go out?
Well, the thing was that I was given a security officer who was going to come to the head table. I had already introduced the head table. And this security man was supposed to come and tell me which door to go to. But unlike you, I wasn't experienced in television, so the lights went on. And I was blinded, and I couldn't see the security guy. And I thought, what the hell, So I had to ad lib. And he finally came up to the head table and said, Jesus Christ, the kitchen. So I ran over to the kitchen, and I opened the door, and there he was, this big man, smiling. And I don't know why I said it, but I said, Mr. President, I've never met the President of the United States in the kitchen before. And he slapped me on the shoulder, and he said, well, I've never met the President of the Empire Club before in the kitchen. And off we went.
Nice.
He was terrific.
You met Margaret Thatcher.
I did.
She asked if you were related to Sir William van Straubenzee in England. You said, yes, my lady, he is my cousin. To which she said,
pity.
How does one react when the Prime Minister of Great Britain basically says, I can't stand your cousin?
Well, I already knew that. He had been a junior minister in her government. And actually, he was a junior minister when she was the Minister of Education in the Heath government. And they didn't get along very well. And so when she did become Prime Minister, she sent him to Ireland as a sort of flunky up there. And he spent, I think, 4 years up in Ireland. So it wasn't the greatest appointment.
Or a big surprise to you when you found out
No.
she didn't like him either?
She was a dry and he was a wet, as they say.
Gotcha. Mm-hmm. You got to hang out with Audrey Hepburn.
I did.
The glorious and wondrous actress. Mm-hmm. I don't know if we can do this. Can we, which camera you want me to show this to? Okay, camera, look at that. I mean, how many people get to do that in life? That was pretty sweet. She came here to speak to the Empire Club, and you chaperoned her all over the city?
I did.
What was she like?
She was fantastic. I have never met a woman who is as beautiful inside as she was outside. She got off, I told the story about my wife and I, Mary, going to Vancouver to meet her. I thought they were going to be at the Four Seasons in Toronto. So I just assumed that. And then I got a telegram from her, Robert Walters, with whom she was living, and he mentioned that he'd see me at the Orpheum Theater. So I didn't want to lose her. I thought, this is a big thing, I've got to go. So we went out to Vancouver, got into the hotel room, and Mary said, I wanted some coffee. And she said, well, I'm not paying $16 for a glass of orange juice or whatever, right?
Yes.
So she went down to the basement to get some coffee, and on the way back, she met Audrey Hepburn in the elevator. So she and Audrey Hepburn had a great chat about flowers and gardens, and I'm meanwhile sitting up in the room wondering where the hell my coffee was. And finally Mary came in, and she had a big smile on her face, and I said, where the hell have you been? And she said, I've been talking to Audrey Hepburn. Well, that was fine, except the next day I went over to the Orpheum Theater, and Robert Walters and I met in the lobby, and we negotiated what would happen for the 3 days she was in Toronto. And I said, do you think I could meet her? And he said, well, she's on stage with the children, but come on in. So I went into the theater, and he waved at Audrey Hepburn, and she waved back, Tony, see you in Toronto.
Oh, how nice is that?
That was, yeah.
And after her Toronto visit was over, she handed you something. What did she hand you?
She handed me 13 letters to the staff of the Four Seasons Hotel, each one individually written. And she asked me to take them back to the hotel and deliver them personally.
What a class act.
Well, I mean, she was wonderful. And one of the things I should tell you is that Tony Hoff, who was the captain of the Royal York second floor, where the Empire Club held its meetings, asked me if he could come to the meeting. And I said, well, why don't you meet her at the front door of the Royal York when the limo pulls up, and I'll make sure that, she says hello. And so I said to her in the limo, Tony Hoff's going to be there. He's going to be in a kilt. It would be nice if you said hello to him, because I told her what he did for us. She got out of the limo, went up to Tony Hoff, threw her arms around him, gave him a kiss, and the photographer got the picture.
Wow.
And he had this thing blowing up in his office for years.
I'll bet.
That's what she was like.
Near the end of your book, you talk rather candidly about your fight against prostate cancer.
Yes.
How's that going?
Oh, fine, thank you. It's wonderful. It was a humbling experience, as I'm sure it is for all people who have it. I didn't expect it to be quite as bad as it was. They don't tell you everything, right? So.
Do they tell you how long you have?
No, he didn't do that. I don't think that he felt there was any long-term problem. I think it was fine, except that the business of having to travel in a car, and stop. There aren't washrooms every 15 miles, So that was the humbling experience, that sort of stuff.
Well, it's all there, 350 plus pages. As you look back at your life now, having written about it, what do you think?
I think I'm very fortunate. I have a wonderful family. I've had a wonderful experience. I mean, being the chairman and president of the York Club, it's a great experience. And the people I've met are just fantastic. I mean, look at this, meeting you, And I have to say that John Perry and Anne Vallone, she did the graphics.
It's a beautiful book.
It is.
I mean, the look of the book is beautiful.
Oh, she was fantastic.
Although there is one question that I think people are going to want to understand, and that is, the book is called Rind in the Marmalade.
Yes.
What is that a reference to?
Well, it's a reference to the fact that years ago, Mary and I went on a vacation to Bermuda. And we stayed at the Coral Beach Club, and it's a beautiful place. And I blew my IBM pension money on this holiday, because I was leaving IBM. And every morning, the maid would come in with a tray, and there was a jar of marmalade on the tray. And every morning, I would say to Mary, there's lots of rind in the marmalade. And after the fourth time, she said, I'm sick of hearing that. Don't say it anymore. So we got back to Toronto, and when I told one of my stories to some group that we were with, she would say, she'd pinch me and say, there's rind in the marmalade, which meant shut up and don't tell it again. So that's how.
That's your catchphrase for the two of you.
Yeah.
It was a delightful read. And we thank you very much for coming into TVO tonight and sharing some stories about it.
And I enjoyed your book, by the way, or your books, and I'm looking forward to the Bill Davis book.
Aren't you kind?
No, not at all.
Well, thank you very
much, Steve.
Rind in the Marmalade, A Headhunter's Tales by Tony Van Straubenzee. Thanks, Tony.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.